Judaism. In all of our conversations, we've said that we want to look for these elements of religions. They're more prevalent in some religions than in others, but in almost every religion, we have these ideas, the name of a religion, a name of God, of the divine, founder symbols, and then this idea of the sacred, right? Sacred scripture, sacred language, sacred color, sacred space, and then how we communicate our reverence to the sacred through creed and ritual, sometimes being led by a ritual leader who might also be sacred or sanctified, and then an understanding of miracles and magic, as well as time itself and how to celebrate or when to celebrate those rituals. In Judaism, Judaism is one of the older religions of the world. It is arguably the oldest or second oldest continuously practiced religion in the West, depending on whether you define Zoroastrianism as a Western religion or not. But Zoroastrianism and Judaism are the two most long-lived religions in the West. And we've talked about how Hinduism is the longest, the oldest religion in the East. When you have a longevity, you're going to have division. And sometimes those are acrimonious and sometimes they're harmonious. We've talked about that there's two types of Jains, for example. We've talked about that there are at least three types of Buddhists, for example. Well, historically, there are three types of Jews. This would go back approximately 22 to 2,500 years ago. So from about 2,500 years ago till about 2,000 years ago, there were three types of Jews. Those are known as the Sadducees, the Pharisees, and the Essenes. Okay? All modern day Jews are descendants from the Pharisees, because what had happened was the Sadducees were the priestly urban Jews, the ones that were responsible for maintaining the temple and were associated with the monarchy of Israel and later the puppet regime when Israel became part of the Roman Empire. Well, when the temple is destroyed, and we'll talk about that later, but when the temple is destroyed in 70 CE, if there's no temple, there's no reason to have priestly Sadducees who maintain the temple, right? So they essentially all dissipate. And in the case of the Essenes, they're not well known, and I'll explain why they're not well known in a moment, but the Essenes basically all convert to Christianity as Christianity becomes a sect of Judaism and then ultimately its own religion. So when you think about the Christian texts, you've definitely heard the term, if you've read the Christian texts, you've heard the term Pharisee. And it's actually, the Christian texts also include the term Sadducee, but it's not as common. But with my explanation, you can understand why it's not as common, because the Sadducees, while the Sadducees were responsible for the execution of Jesus of Nazareth, by the time that the Gospels were being written down, the Sadducees didn't exist. So the Pharisees are really framed as the so-called bad guys in the New Testament because they still exist at the time that the Christians are spreading and expanding. There is nothing inherently wrong with the Pharisees. The Pharisees were a reform movement who were calling out the Sadducees for their excesses and their non-observance to the true teachings of Judaism. In many ways, you could almost make the argument that Jesus himself was a Pharisee. And then the reason the Essenes are not mentioned in the Christian text is because, like I said, they don't exist by the time they're being written down, and you don't need to make them into a straw soldier bad guy because they've converted and they're part of the Christian tradition. So again, all Jews are descendant from the Pharisees, and those that survived the destruction of the temple in the diaspora or the diaspora, depending on your preferred pronunciation. And currently in the world today, there are basically three sects of Judaism. There are the Orthodox Jews, and that would include the Hasidic and Chabad sects of Judaism. There are conservative Jews, and there are Reformed Jews. Major difference between Reformed Jews and the conservative and Orthodox is that in Reformed Jews, women can be rabbis. So those are the three major types of Jews that exist today. If you really want even more detail, there are other historical and concurrent sects of Judaism, but it's easier and it's safe to just stick with the three historical and the three current types. I should also add that the Reformed Jewish movement is primarily an American movement. There are not very many Reformed Jews outside of the United States. Within the United States, most Jews are either Reformed or secular, meaning they don't practice. They're ethnic Jews, but they do not practice Judaism as a religion. And then about 18% are what are called conservative Jews, and about 10% are Orthodox. And again, that would include the Chabad and the Hasidic movements as well. So who's the founder of Judaism? Well, in each religion, people often say that God is the founder, right? God called Abraham, God called Muhammad, God called Jesus, God called Moses, who we consider to really be the founder of Judaism. But in religions that don't have a specific prophet or founder, it makes more sense to say that the divine itself is the founder of the religion. God itself, himself, herself, invites creation to become one with the universe. That's more prevalent, again, in those Dharmic and Eastern religions or indigenous religions. In the Western religions, very often there's a founder, and so there's this tension. Who's the founder? Jews will say God's the founder, or Muslims will say God is the founder. Christians will say Jesus is the founder, because remember, they also think that Jesus is God as well, so it's easier to overlap the two. And while all three of the Abrahamic religions recognize Abraham himself as the father of all of these religions, each one has a prophet that makes their Abrahamic religion unique. And it is Moses that makes Israel into a nation, right? He brings them out of captivity in Egypt. He's the one that has the experience with God, with Yahweh, I am who am, on Mount Sinai. It is Moses that enters into the covenant with the Ten Commandments. And there have been multiple covenants, but it is Moses's covenant which was foundational, and then his heir, Joshua, who goes into the land of Canaan and creates Israel, that's later destroyed by the Romans and then recreated in the 1940s. So Moses is the founder of Judaism. He follows the archetypical path of the hero's journey. He's threatened at birth. He's taken into exile, has a hidden identity, is raised as a prince of Egypt, and then has his invitation to stand up for his fellow Jews. In that moment, he strikes down the Egyptian. He flees then. He's rejecting his invitation to be part of Israel, or to apologize and reject Israel and become part of the Pharaoh's household again. And he has that time in the wilderness, another common motif in religions. And then he hears that calling, and he's invited with his brother to go back and take up his place as the leader of the people of Israel. He confronts the Pharaoh. There's miracles and magic. He shows the power of God working through him, and then he leads his people to the promised land. So it is a hero's journey by every step of the way. In Judaism, the symbol of Judaism is the Star of David. It is the six-pointed star, but there are other symbols of Israel or of the Jewish people as well, but it is really more of a modern creation that the Star of David is the symbol of all of the people of Israel. If you think about it, the number 12 is really a symbol of Israel, the 12 tribes, that all the Jews are descendant from the 12 tribes of Israel. And so even the missing tribes, which again, anecdotally through DNA, we're now finding the missing tribes. We found a tribe of Jews in South Africa, actually. And there was another tribe of Jews that we didn't find. We knew that they were in Ethiopia, but after the Ethiopian forced starvation by the Derg in the 1980s, the Jews of Ethiopia returned to Israel. So I guess what I want to say is on this slide, this idea of symbols. Yes, the Star of David is a symbol of Israel, but there are other symbols too, like the menorah, like the number 12, and the Star of David is really more of a modern creation, and it is on the current flag of the state of Israel. The Holy language of Israel is Hebrew. We talked about that. It makes sense that whatever the language was that the prophet or the founder was speaking would become a holy language. In this case, Moses spoke Hebrew, and Hebrew is the language that was written on the Ten Commandments. And we talked about how Sanskrit is the holy language of the Dharmic religions. Old Persian is the holy language of Zoroastrianism. Arabic is the holy language of Islam. And then, although the early Christians spoke Aramaic, very quickly, Greek became the holy language of Christianity, and it is still in the Eastern Orthodox tradition, it is still the holy language, and in the Western Christian churches, it became Latin. So the Torah, the 5 scrolls, the Pentateuch, the Talmud, these are the 5 primary books. These are the sacred scriptures of the Jewish faith. Now, if you think about the Christian text, there are other Hebrew texts, but it is the first 5, the Pentateuch, which are the most important. You could make the analogy that in the New Testament, the 4 Gospels are the most important, and then the letters and the book of Revelation and the book of Acts are secondary, but they're all in the New Testament. So in what the Christians call the Old Testament, or what some scholars call the Hebrew Bible, there are a number of books, but it is the Torah, the 5 books, the Pentateuch, the Talmud, which is the most sacred. The Torah has to be written on vellum, on animal skin, and it is written by hand by rabbis. The rabbinical schools in New York have rabbis where all they do all day long, their job, their career, is to rewrite the Torah, the holy scripture of Jews, of Judaism, of the people of Israel. The scrolls are so important that we've talked about the nexus between the practical and the theological. So in terms of reverence and theological applications, people don't touch the Torah. And then practically speaking, human oils could damage the animal skin. And so that you'll see that the Torah is kept on scrolls, and it can be wound and unwound without being touched. And then they will use a pointer to hold their place, and also kind of to hold the scrolls open as well. The scrolls are kept in what's called an ark. It is symbolic of the Ark of the Covenant. So the scrolls in any synagogue, the scrolls of the community are kept in what's known as the ark, which is typically behind the altar or the podium. The scrolls are taken out and placed on the altar and are read from the altar during the rituals and the ceremonies. Here's a closer picture of 2 men reading from the Torah. Notice the heads are covered. You've heard of the word yarmulke. The word kippah is also a Jewish word, or a Yiddish word for a head covering. It is, again, this idea of showing respect, that you're in the presence of God. Remember that scene of the burning bush where God said, "Take off your shoes, Moses." That taking off your shoes, covering your head, is a sign of reverence and respect for the divine. In this case, in this picture, one person's wearing a kippah, the other person is wearing just a hat, covering his head in the presence of the scroll while reading the scroll. The sacred color, always controversial. People don't often identify sacred colors within their own religion, or they sometimes, as I've said before, resist the word sacred. They might say prolific or common. I believe that anything we use to communicate our spirituality or to try to communicate with the divine, all of that is sacred. So yes, it's a sacred color. And in Judaism, the sacred color is blue, and specifically a lighter blue, a powder blue, if you will. And you'll see this predominantly on the Israeli flag, right? On the uniforms of the Israeli national athletic teams. Just as American politicians wear blue or red ties, depending on whether they're Democrats or Republicans, you'll notice Israeli prime ministers, Benjamin Netanyahu, wearing a blue tie. And if you think, and I'm not trying to be funny here, I'm trying to be practical. If you think about Target, Walmart, King Soopers, if you think about grocery stores, during Hanukkah season and during Passover season, all these commercial enterprises in the United States will have an aisle of Jewish products, kosher foods, and so forth, and the color coding of that aisle will be blue, powder blue. Pay attention to it next Hanukkah, next Passover. You'll see powder blue signs commercially in the stores in the United States. It's a way for Jewish people to see which aisle to go to purchase the things that they need for those sacred rituals and celebrations. Jews worship in a synagogue, but they don't want to. The Jews want to worship in the temple, just like Muslims want to worship in Mecca. So it is the goal of all Jews to worship in the temple. The temple has been destroyed, I mentioned already, it was destroyed in the year 70 CE. It was in fact the second temple. So the state of Israel and Orthodox Jews throughout the world believe that Israel and Jews should build the third temple. We'll talk about that in a couple of moments. But because Jews do not have the third temple yet, they can't worship in the temple, and so they have to worship in synagogues. And also Jews, because of the diaspora, the diaspora, are all over the world. And so of course here in Denver, you can't worship in the temple in Jerusalem today. And so you worship in synagogues. If you come from a Christian tradition, you might, it's almost analogous to the idea of a chapel versus a church, okay? There are few rules about what a synagogue has to look like on the outside. In fact, in Pilsen, I believe it's in the Czech Republic now, in Pilsen, the synagogue looks to me like a Catholic church. In Florence, to me, the main synagogue looks like almost a Byzantine-esque church. And in parts of the Arab world, synagogues might look almost like mosques, because the external really doesn't matter. The internal, you find common elements, the same elements that you'll see in Christian churches, because again, Christians started out as Jews, as a sect of Judaism. And so there's an altar, there's an ark. Christians would call the ark a tabernacle. Both have altars, both have lectionaries or podiums. And very often they'll have two, one for singing and one for preaching. And there'll be chairs or pews for the congregation to sit in. We talked about, however, that in the Muslim faith, there are no chairs or pews. That would be a distinction there. So the inside of a synagogue would be very comfortable looking to many Christians. You'll see the symbols used, the menorahs and the Star of David, as well as other common symbols of Judaism. So I've mentioned twice before, I'm going to go into more detail now, this idea of the temple. The temple was built by David as a home for the Ark of the Covenant. Moses had his experience with the burning bush. Moses then led the people out of Israel. Moses then climbed Mount Sinai, had another experience with the divine, and was given the 10 Commandments on 2 stones. And he took those stones down, and they exemplified the covenant between the Jewish people and the divine. And then they needed to be, you can't walk around carrying the 10 Commandments all the time. You need to put them somewhere. Again, the nexus between the practical and the divine. You put them somewhere to be safe and also to transport them. And that's what was built. If you've seen Indiana Jones, that is the Ark of the Covenant, the Ark, what's going to hold the covenant. And so there's this Ark with winged cherubim and 2 long poles that hold the Ark. And this was carried before the people of Israel when they were going through the Sinai Desert. And when they went into battle, they carried the Ark before them. It was the symbol of the covenant and the power of Yahweh. Yahweh is Hebrew, Yah, I am, way, who am. I am who am. God is existence. If you think about that, what do those words mean? I am who am. I am existence. It's a very dharmic Hindu thing to say, isn't it? This division between the dharmic and the Abrahamic religions is ultimately a mirage. that God is just existence. It is the eternal spark of the universe. And so the temple was built to house the Ark of the Covenant when the people moved into the land of Canaan, became Israel, and when David went to make his capital in the city of Jerusalem. And so you have this temple. The temple was destroyed by the Babylonians during the first exile, and it was rebuilt. That second temple was then, it was actually just being completed during the time of Jesus of Nazareth by King Herod, the puppet leader of Israel for the overlords of the Roman Empire. And it was just being finished when, just a few decades later, it was destroyed by the Romans during the Maccabean revolt. The Romans said, if you're going to rise up against us, we're going to destroy your holy place, and we will cast you throughout the world. And that's the diaspora, the diaspora of the Jewish people. And that is, most of the Jewish people fled to other parts of the Roman Empire, specifically Spain, and they maintained the Sephardic traditions, and then others to the parts of Gaul and Italy, and then eventually spreading into Germany and Ukraine and Poland and Russia. And that community of Jews are called the Ashkenazi Jews. The holiest place in Israel, therefore, is where the temple used to be, where it was before it was destroyed. Although it was destroyed, one wall was not destroyed, the Western Wall. Jews will call it the Wailing Wall because they go and they cry because of what happened to their sacred space. There is a picture of the Wailing Wall, the Western Wall, and it is a Jewish tradition not just to pray before the Western Wall or the Wailing Wall, to make pilgrimage to the Western Wall, but also to write prayers and insert the prayers on pieces of paper in between the cracks of the broken Second Temple. If you look in the picture to the left of the Wailing Wall, within the 2,000 years that the Jews had been kicked out of Israel, in that time, the people of the area, who we now call Palestinian, that name didn't really exist at that point. They would have been part of the wider Arab community or Ottoman Empire, but we use the word Palestinian nowadays to distinguish the Arab people of Israel from the Arab people of other nation states. But that golden dome that you see is the Dome of the Rock, which is a holy place. It is the third holiest place in Islam. And this is the spot that Muslims believe the Prophet Muhammad was brought to during his dark night of the soul. So the controversy in the Middle East is that these two holy places, the number one holy place in Judaism and the number three holy place in Islam, are on the same piece of property. And that is at the root of the problems in the Middle East and the conflict between Muslims and Jews. This is an illustration of what the second temple looked like, that was built by King Herod. And in the bottom right-hand corner, you can see again the juxtaposition of the Dome of the Rock and the Western Wall. And if you can see how the Dome of the Rock is at higher elevation, it's on what's called the Temple Mount. Jewish archaeologists are digging through and under the Western Wall and working their way underneath the Temple Mount. They're trying to find artifacts of the Second Temple for the building of the Third Temple. But consider how that might come across to Muslims to know that their third holiest spot has archaeologists digging underneath it. And so that is also an example of the conflict and the frustrations of both communities. Here's a picture of American leaders going to the Western Wall. It's a tradition now. Traditionally, people who run for president, so we'll probably see Joe Biden do this. Every president goes to Israel either when they're running for president of the United States or shortly thereafter. Often they'll go to the Berlin Wall as well. You think about Reagan, think about Obama and others. But here are pictures of Obama, Chris Christie, John McCain, Mitt Romney, Bill Clinton, 3 popes as well. So all 9 of these people are not Jewish, right? And yet they're going to the Western Wall to show respect for the people of Israel, of the Jewish faith, And also in terms of the politicians, the 6 politicians, they're showing their political commitment to Israel as well. The person in the pictures, the person behind President Obama, the person behind Bill Clinton, and the person behind John McCain in these pictures, that is the chief rabbi of Israel. There are 2 chief rabbis of Israel. There is a chief rabbi of the Ashkenazi Jews, and there's a chief rabbi of the Sephardic Jews as well. The creed of Judaism, what Jews pray, like Christians pray the Our Father, like Muslims pray the Shahada, Jews pray the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Again, like the Shahada, a very simple prayer, or perhaps chronologically, I should say, the Shahada, very similar to the Shema. So why do we have to fight when we believe these same ideas, that there is one God? The Shema there is written in both Hebrew. In Hebrew, the holy language, you read from right to left instead of left to right. And also in Hebrew, there are no vowels. So when you transliterate the name of God, which, by the way, Orthodox Jews will not say the name of God, and you shouldn't say it in front of Orthodox Jews. But when you say the name of God, Yahweh, you'll see it spelled in English Yahweh. The vowels are not correct. You should just spell it with the 4 letters. YHWH, Yahweh, I am, being, life itself. There is only one God. The Lord is one. And what Jews will do is, in almost any doorway, check that, in any doorway, Jews will put a piece of the Torah that says the Shema on the door frame. And so you can tell if you're entering a Jewish home, or when I taught at a Jewish school, every door frame in the school had a piece of the Torah, the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And the box that holds this piece of the scroll is always put crooked on the door frame to show, again, like the Muslim imagery of art, that we are all imperfect. That only God is perfect. How dare we put it on the door frame perfectly, right? The ritual leaders in Judaism are the elders. First of all, any Jewish male who has gone through the rites of passage and become an adult, typically around the age 13, is a leader. You need to have 10 adult males in the conservative and Orthodox traditions in order to have a service. If you have 9, you cannot have a service in the conservative and Orthodox Jewish faiths. But there are also rabbis who go to rabbinical school to earn their degrees. When I talked about the scroll being put on door frames, Jews will very often also have pieces of the Torah wrapped up on their arms, and as well as on their head. I grew up in the Catholic tradition, and in the Catholic tradition, we say, may the word of God always be on my mind, on my lips, and always find a place in my heart. It's the same idea that Jews are remembering to keep the word of God on their mind and in their actions with their hands. The rituals that Jews practice, these are just a few of them. There are so many rituals. You're familiar with keeping kosher, the dietary restrictions of the Jewish people. Jews observe the Sabbath, which is Saturday, but it doesn't start at midnight and go to midnight. It starts at sunset on Friday and goes to sunset on Saturday. Some other rituals that you might be familiar with are the fact that during a Jewish marriage, they get married underneath a tent, and the final act of the marriage is to crush a piece of glass to show that the bond, the covenant between the spouses cannot be undone. Male children are circumcised. It's a beautiful ritual where they also believe that the prophet Elijah is at every circumcision, just as the prophet is at every Seder, every Passover dinner. They'll be leaving a chair for Elijah. There's the rites of passage in all of 3 of the sects of Judaism. There's what's called the bar mitzvah, the male rite of passage, and in the Reform movement, there'll be the bat mitzvah, a female rite of passage as well. During that rite of passage, the children will select a section of the Torah to memorize in Hebrew. They will recite it in Hebrew in front of their congregation, and then they will maybe share some thoughts about what they think it means. And all human stages of life have rituals in all of these religions we've talked about: birth, adulthood, marriage, death. And so one of the common rituals that you might be aware of already, but the way Jewish people recognize, honor, celebrate death is it's called sitting Shiva, where all of the glass and mirrors in a home are covered, and the community comes and visits and sits with the family, sitting Shiva. And during, I should say, recognize the picture on the center left, that is the picture of the #1 road, #1 highway in Israel on the Sabbath. You can see there's nobody driving a car. There's some people on bikes. During Sabbath, you don't work, you don't do anything. It is a time for God. It is set aside as a day of rest, as we know from Genesis. In terms of understandings of miracle and magic, I talked already about the power of the Ark of the Covenant, that the Ark of the Covenant, when leading the armies of Israel, cannot be defeated. We talked about the menorah. You might know the story of the menorah, that during the Maccabean revolt, that there was only enough oil to light the candles for one day, but the oil lasted for many more days. During the Seder, that Elijah is going to be there and be present with the people celebrating the Seder, recognizing the miracles of the escape from Israel, recognizing the miracles of the escape from Egypt. And then perhaps one of the lesser known miracles in Judaism is the 36. The idea that part of the covenant that God has entered into with the people of Israel is at any point in history, there are 36 perfect people. And even part of the perfection of those 36 people is they don't know that they're one of the perfect people. And if any one of the 36 dies, then the end of the world will occur. And so you will see literature, fiction, movies about evil people, the devil, trying to kill one of the 36 in order to bring the end of the world. Notice that 3 and 6, those are derivatives of 3. So we have 36, which is, again, a derivative of 3, a holy number. So at any point, there are the perfect ones. There are the perfect souls, 36, the 36 among us. The Jewish calendar, because it's an older calendar, I think I've mentioned before, one of the patterns is the older a religion is, the more likely it is to be a lunar religion, to have a lunar calendar, not a solar calendar. So yes, the Jewish calendar is a lunar calendar. Because it's lunar, it has 28 days, and so it doesn't fit in exactly to a solar calendar, because they are, again, tracking the moon, and therefore the Jewish months do not perfectly correspond to the current secular calendar, which is actually based on a Catholic Church's calendar. The most important holidays in Judaism, the 2 high holy days, are Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, and they are in the fall, and one of them is the Jewish New Year, the other one is the Day of Atonement, the day that all sins can be forgiven, the day that you reflect and ask for forgiveness. But you have other holidays, the Festival of Tents, Sukkot, you have Purim, Hanukkah, Passover, and others as well. And each one of these is biblically based and historically based in the experiences of the nation of Israel. These holidays have certain foods or practices. I've already mentioned that Sabbath, which is in and of itself, every Sabbath is a holiday. The practice is to rest, to not work and not do anything. We know about the lighting of candles in Hanukkah. You may know about the Seder meal during Passover. You may know about the fall harvest and the horn to be used in the high holidays, the tents in Sukkot, the Festival of Tents, and certain foods. And more in the last 50 years or so has emerged a non-historical holiday, which is the Holocaust Memorial Day. So when Jews will light a candle to remember the Jews that were lost to Nazi aggression. So every religion has these elements. Judaism is no different. Judaism has a deity. Yahweh, I am who am. They have a founder, Abraham and Moses. They have a symbol, the menorah, the Star of David. They have a sacred language, Hebrew, a sacred scripture, the Torah, the Pentateuch, sacred color, light blue, sacred space, the Temple Mount, the second temple, and maybe the third temple. And before the third temple is built, we have synagogues throughout the world. The Creed, the Shema. Hear, O Israel, there is one God, the Lord is one. Rituals of praying, reading the Torah, of the festivals of Sukkot, Purim, Hanukkah, Yom Kippur, Rosh Hashanah. Ritual leaders, the rabbis who lead the congregations. An understanding of the miracles and magics, the divine intervention in the world, as well as how to understand and celebrate these holidays, rituals, and time itself. So that's my presentation on Judaism.